Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the top 10 decks that I expect out of the new format. Now, if anyone doesn't know, there's a patch coming out within the next couple days, and I'm going to do a full patch review on that with a couple of other people. I'm doing a few little tidbits on that, including the patch review. So the first bit is this video, which is going to highlight the top 10 decks and a couple honorable mentions of decks to test against and decks that are being hyped and might be played. Now keep in mind, these are not in order of top 10 best decks. These are top 10 most played and what you've got to prepare for. So barring the last couple decks from probably 5 onwards, I'm gonna say that most of these decks are just on the list at certain ranks because of how popular they're gonna be and how hyped they are. Now, other thing, at the end of the video, in the comment section, I'm going to be looking for two decks from everyone. So the weekly show topic for this weekend is going to be a in-depth deck breakdown, as in skeleton lists, techs you can run, counters to it, of 2 of the decks from this video. So if you want me to do a certain deck, you can each vote on 2 decks, since it's going to be 2 decks in the actual video. So vote on 2 decks, put it in the comment section, and random phone in the background. Anyway, no, I don't want to view it. Normally I'd cut this out, but I think this is actually a pretty hilarious way of being interrupted, which is some random alarm phone interrupting me with a message from Vodafone. Anyway, so put the 2 decks you want to see in the comment section, and I'll tally them up, and then the 2 most popular decks I'll break down. And then the 3 next most popular, I'm going to do in a video next week. Break down all of those, less detail than the ones in the weekly, but I'm still going to go over them in some very skeleton list and text and such. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Now, first we'll start with some honorable mentions. First one I'm going to go over is Hunter Control variants. Now, Hunter Control is a deck that's seeing a little bit of hype. Not a massive amount, but seeing a bit, so you might come across it every so often. It's basically, there's 2 different types. There's traps, and then there's some of the charge minions that are playing 2 or 3 traps as opposed to all of them. Now, I think a lot of the hype is coming from things like Unleash the Hounds, with that being changed. So while I don't think the deck is going to be particularly good, I would still test against it just to see if it works for you and if it's a bad matchup or anything, because every so often you're going to play against this, but it's not going to be that common, but it's something to know. Second one is Rogue Combo. Now, Rogue Combo came back in the last MLG tournament, so I'm expecting a bit of hype behind this. The reason it's an honorable and not in the actual top 10 is there aren't any top players picking up on this yet. So we're going to have to see in the next couple of weeks how it performs, but I'm not really going to make a prediction on this. Just note that it is there. Like Rogue Combo with Preparations, Edwin Van Cleef, SI7, Eviscerates, Head Cracks, Shadow Steps, all the cheap spells. So anyway, on to the actual top 10. Now the first one is Priest Shields Up. Now this is a deck that has not been performing well at all. However, there's a lot of top players who are really hyping this right now. It's a super hyped deck. People are going to be running it. People want to see if Priest can work, and Shields Up is one of the best engines to run with this kind of stuff, being the Ancient Watcher, Defender of Argus, Sunfury Protector line. Now, I'm not sure how the deck is going to perform, but I would definitely test against it because I'm guessing a lot of people are going to be playing it with so many of the sort of top streamers and players switching over to it just to test it out. So it's definitely going to be a force in the metagame. The question is, how much of a force will it be? I'm expecting it to be played a lot, but I don't know if it's that good. We're going to have to see from some of the better deck builders in the game, see what they come up with, see how people can play it, see how it does in ranked and tournaments in general. It's something to watch out for, though, because it is definitely a hyped deck, and it's definitely going to be played. And if you enjoy Priest, now is probably a time to test it with so many other people trying out Priest. Gives you some ideas, things like that. Now, for number 9, we have Paladin Giants. This was a deck that could not do well before the patch, and the reason was Pyroblast. Now, the Giants deck, it was a bit of a derivative from the Path of Justice deck, which was a bit of an sort of all-around paladin deck. That's a mid-range, some late game, some aggro. And it was a good deck, but it seemed to split off into aggro, and then the mid-range section left. And it became Paladin Giants. So it uses things like Guardian of Kings and Tyrion and Ragnaros and things like that, some late game cards, with early game being held down by Aldor Peacekeepers and Equalities and Consecrations and True Silvers and basic Paladin removal. But the real punch in the deck comes late game, where you play double Molten Giant when you get low and then start healing yourself back up again. The reason this didn't work was because you needed to be on 10 life for this combo to work, and if you're on 10 life, you're dead to Pyro. So it didn't work in the old metagame as much. It was a decent deck, but it was being sniped by mages. But now, I feel like it's a tier 2 deck, and it might win a tournament every so often, or just do well in a tournament. It's definitely one to watch out for, although I do not think it's going to be super popular, but it is a deck to watch out for. It's a lot of punch. They can run the Shields Up engine in this deck, although it's a little bit less likely in Paladin. They can run the Shields Up engine, and it will still do a decent amount in a Paladin deck, especially with access to things like Aldor Peacekeeper. It's a deck that is not particularly hyped, but I do think could do very well. Mage aggro, what is this doing here? It got nerfed, right? Yeah, it did. But just to be clarified, 10 mana on a Pyro is a big nerf, but it's still going to be played every so often. There's still going to be that guy who plays Mage aggro and snipes people. So don't ignore Mage aggro. You're going to come across it on ladder, you're going to come across it in tournaments, in single elimination tournaments. It's still going to knock people out, just less often. So definitely keep testing against it. The deck is not dead, it's just not as dominant as it was. So that's all I'm going to say on Mage aggro. And onto Warlock aggro. Now, I'm going to sort of flow through the Mage and Warlock aggro together, because Warlock aggro is another deck that got nerfed. It loses the Blood Imp. Now, what did Blood Imp do? It protected it against Phantom Knives. It protected it against non-deadly poison dagger with Blade Flurry in some cases, but it also protected against Swipe. If you had double, it protected against Starfall. Basically, it just protected it from all the AoE that makes the deck bad. So without that, it loses a lot of power. However, it can still kill you. Do not think that this deck is gone. It will still be in the metagame. People are still going to see it. Murloc variants are still being played. You'll still see them around. They're still going to be irritating. You just don't have to deal with the Blood Imp, which is a big deal. But the deck will still be run. Do not underestimate it, or it will snipe you every so often. Now, the last aggro deck, well, pure aggro deck I'm going to go over, comes in at number 6, being Paladin aggro. Now, why is this the highest out of the 3 aggro decks? Normally it's the lowest. The reason it's the highest is because the rest of the list going down. They're much slower decks, much beefier decks, and Paladin aggro has the best matchup out of the aggro decks against these big beefy decks. Why? Because they have access to things like Aldor Peacekeeper, Equality, True Silver to brute force some taunts, Knife Juggler with Divine Shield so they can't remove it easily. Sword of Justice helps pump your stuff up to get through some of his bigger things like Harvest Golem in terms of defense. And it's just a solid deck against these late game decks. It was always too slow to beat out the other aggro decks. However, against these late game decks, it comes out the gate fast and powerful, and it deals a lot of damage with Sword of Justices, shuts down all of their threats, and just goes straight for the win. And a lot of the time it will work. Paladin aggro might do quite well in a couple of tournaments. I expect it to be hyped up quite a bit once people start playing it again, because a lot of the more popular streamers like Artosis, for example, have been playing this a lot in the past. They might go back to it, and a lot of the other people that are followed on Twitch and such have played Paladin aggro in the past. So I think it will be hyped a lot when it comes out again, and someone gets a variant to work against the rest of the metagame. So expect to see this a lot on ladder especially. Now onto the top 5. Now these are the decks that I actually think are going to be super, super powerful. And I'm putting them in order. Like, these are in fact in order. I think they're going to be really strong. Let's start with number 5, Shaman Midrange. Now this is a deck that pretty much died off from the metagame, but not for lack of trying. This deck tried to come back a couple of weeks ago and actually made a couple of top 4s. but mages were sniping them. Like, Pyroblast would get past all your taunts, deal a bunch of damage, they have no sustain. Pyroblast can't be used as readily as it was, and Mage will be less popular, so naturally Shaman becomes better. Not to mention, they have really large stuff and access to things like Fire Elemental, which deals with threats like Harvest Golem, doing a couple extra damage to any Twilight Drakes or Giants without hurting yourself. They have access to Totems, which is very, very good against shields up. You just build up your board and then just smash through slowly. So I think Shaman midrange could be very good. Now, we're going to see probably some of the older Shaman midrange players come into the actual fray again, like Spaj, for example, who was very famous for his Shaman midrange, but once Healing Totem got nerfed and Pyroblast went up in popularity, he got a little bit messed up as far as Shaman midrange goes, so he switched. But I am expecting some players to go back to Shaman midrange. I think it's still very, very good, and they're getting rid of one of the counters to it, which is the big, big deal. Now, wait a second, Jotto. This is a warrior deck. They nerfed warrior. You can't put warrior in your top 4. I will put warrior in my top 4. Deal with it. Anyway. Warrior Legendaries, for anyone who doesn't know, is a deck that was played by Christopher in one of the Swiss tournaments. And having seen Dark 1X play the deck, it's absurd. Like, I'll put the actual link to the deck in the description for this one, because it is a very interesting deck to look at. But it's a control warrior where instead of playing the combos for late game, they just flood the board with legendaries and slowly grind your opponent out. They have Alex Straza, Ragnaros, Deathwing even, Grom Hellscream, even Baron Geddon makes an appearance. Just a bunch of very, very large win conditions. And you just grind your opponent down with win conditions because they can't deal with it as much. And it's a very effective deck. It has a even matchup against all the ones going up, apart from maybe the one at number 1 to some extent. Depends how you draw. But it is a very powerful deck and can see quite good win percentage in Legend and in tournaments. But the deck is quite expensive, so a lot of people aren't piloting it. A lot of the really, really top players are not piloting it. There's a couple of them that are, but that's only because they have the collections to support it. But once people start getting more collections, I do think this deck will come out into the metagame and do a lot of damage, especially with the metagame slowing down as much as it is. Now, on to number 3. This is the deck I know the most about, being Rogue Cantrip, as it is the one I play in Constructed at the moment. And the deck was suffering a lot from mages pre-patch. You couldn't kill mages before turn 8, and they would kill you on turn 8. And you'd always kill them on turn 9. So, now that Pyro is 10 mana, Rogue Cantrip doesn't have that much to deal with anymore. It has a 50% matchup against the 2 top decks above this. It can win against Warrior occasionally. It can win against Shaman midrange quite a lot. The aggro decks are even matchup. It just has an even matchup against all the decks that have been on this list, apart from some of the lower ones where it just flattens them. So I do think the deck is incredibly consistent and can do very, very well with just how much draw you're using. The Novice Engineer change hurts it a bit, but the Novice Engineer change hurt every deck in the format, not just Rogue Cantrip. Literally every deck lost Novice Engineer, not just the Cantrip decks. So I think the deck would be very, very good. You can tech against some of the bigger, slower decks running the Shields Up engine, and I think it can work. Should be very interesting to see Rogue Cantrip and how it does, whether it rises back to dominance like it used to. Now, on to number 2, Warlock Shields Up. Now, I talked about this on the tournament recap, but Shields Up Warlock is running the Shields Up engine with Twilight Drakes and Giants and Jiraxxus for late game and some of the legendaries and silences. And it's a really powerful deck. Don't underestimate it. It will do a lot of damage. For a while, both rank 1 legends on both regions were running this deck. It is one of the best decks in the format. Again, it was being sniped a bit by mages, so its tournament history is a little sketchy. Has made a couple top 4s though. And I do think the deck will become much, much stronger with mage leaving. If you notice the trend here, mage getting weaker, it makes a lot of these other decks stronger because they couldn't handle mage due to the lack of sustain. But with mage getting nerfed as much as it did, I do think that Shields Up Warlock will rise to prominence in the metagame. And it has a good matchup against a lot of the decks. It has 50% matchup against Rogue, Warrior Legendaries, has a good matchup against Shaman, decent matchup against the next deck on this list, and it deals a lot with the aggro decks, and it doesn't have any problems with those. So it's a very, very strong deck, and I would expect to see it a lot. Especially considering, while the budget on this thing is quite high, it's only about as high as some of the other decks on this list that people are already running. So it's proof that people have the collections to run this kind of thing. So I would expect to play against it a lot. It's a very popular deck now, and it's being run a lot in ladder and in tournaments. However, when someone asks you what the best deck in the format is right now, they will most likely answer Druid Beatdown. This deck has won so many tournaments recently, it's insane. It's won 4 EU MLG tournaments in a row. It's got 3 top 4s between the two tournaments just this week. And last week it got a couple, the week before it got a couple. It's been winning some of the top deck tournaments as well. It won a couple Swiss tournaments. Like, it's a super strong deck. It's the best deck of the format in my mind. And now with aggro getting a bit weaker, it can focus more on its other matchups. Like, it doesn't have to deal with aggro. You don't have to play double wild pyromancer anymore. You just don't have to deal with it, apart from maybe to deal with rogue. But you can sideboard that kind of stuff in a tournament like MLG, for example. So I actually do think that this deck will remain the strongest, and it will remain the most consistent. It has the ability to sideboard into anything it wants, or just run tech cards in a Swiss tournament, because it has enough draw power to run tech cards. And with Innervate, you can just get out your legendaries faster than any other deck, and it's a noticeable change. When you get your Ancient of War out 2 turns earlier, or you get your Cenarius out on turn 7, or your Ragnaros on turn 6, that's a huge tempo swing, deals a lot of damage, and you just brute force through everything with this deck, and it does require people to tech against it. And so I do think it's going to be the best performing deck of the format. But anyway, thank you all for watching. As I said, put two decks, not one, 2 decks that you want to see in the weekly show, which, as usual, I'll be doing live on Saturday at 2 p.m. GMT, and I'll put it up on YouTube as soon as I can, depending on what Twitch decides to do. So put 2 decks you want to see from this list. The honorable mentions I'm not going to go over, because the honorable mentions are so untested at the moment that I'm not even going to try. So any of the ones from 1 to 10, put that in the comment section below, and I'll tally them up, and then I'll do 2 of those decks in the weekly show, and then the 3 next popular decks. So from 3 to 5, I'll be doing those in a video next week, probably around the same time as the patch review, unless the patch review comes out in the next couple of days. It's a bit sketchy. That's coming out soon. But anyway, thank you for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me at any point, come on Teamspeak. I'll put the information in the description as usual. I'll put the Warrior deck in the description as well, because that's a deck I think needs to get out a bit more. It's really strong, and a lot of people don't know about it. So anyway, this has been Jotto, signing off.